Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Be sure to check out Dragon Shield for all of the best accessories to protect your decks. TCG Player for cards at great prices while supporting local game stores. And Patreon, where you get awesome benefits for your direct support. Check us out on Twitch every Wednesday evening for great games of CEDH with special guests every week. If you sub to Twitch, you get additional perks such as access to our Discord. Come and see us at SCGCon Pittsburgh this coming weekend. We will be there all weekend hanging out and recording games in the command zone. Stop by and say hey. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have Dante piloting the partner pair of Kodama of the East Tree and Vial Smasher the Fierce. This is a mid-range deck that seeks to combo with Rograkh the Foul-Blooded, Valakut Exploration, or Kiki Jiki. Dante's opening hand contains a Lotus Petal, Exotic Orchard, Arcane Signet, Deadly Rollick, Emergent Zone, Calling the Weak, and a Mana Vault. Next, we have Noah piloting Old Stickfingers. This is a proactive deck that seeks to entomb Rograkh with its commander, reanimate it, and win with a combo. Noah's opening hand contains a Command Tower, Mana Crypt, Wishclaw Talisman, Bolas' Citadel, Mana Vault, Calling Ritual, and his London Mulligan is a Command Beacon. After that, we have Steven piloting the partner pair of Tevesh Zot, Doom of Fools, and Rograkh, Son of Rograkh. This is a Divergent Transformations deck that also seeks to cheat out Rograkh and win with a combo. Steven's opening hand contains a Command Tower, Prismatic Vista, the Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale, Urza's Saga, Village Rites, Faithless Looting, and a Reality Scramble. Finally, we have Zach piloting the partner pair of Tymna the Weaver and Kraum, Ludovic's Opus. This is a blue farm variant that seeks to set up value engines and win with Ad Naus, Peer into the Abyss, Bolas' Citadel, or Underworld Breach lines. Zach's opening hand contains an Ancient Tomb, Tarnished Citadel, City of Brass, Felwar Stone, Dragon's Rage Channeler, Savine's Reclamation, and a Force of Negation. Without further ado, let's kick off this radical raucous rabid raspy rationale. Noah wins the Lord of the Rings movie trivia game and gets to start us off. Noah draws a card for turn and casts a Mana Crypt. He plays a Command Tower. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts Wishclaw Talisman. Noah passes. Steven draws a card for turn and plays a Command Tower. He casts his commander, Rograkh, Son of Rograkh. Steven ends his turn. Zach draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps his Ancient Tomb to cast a Felwar Stone. He casts Dragon's Rage Channeler. Zach shifts the turn to Dante. Dante draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a Mana Vault. Dante passes. During his upkeep, Noah loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and activates Wishclaw Talisman. He fetches up a card into his hand and gives it to Steven. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts Calling Ritual. In response, Steven casts Village Rites, sacrificing Rograkh and drawing 2 cards. Dante floats mana, and then Calling Ritual resolves. Calling Ritual wipes most of the board, and Noah adds 4 black and 1 green. Noah casts Bolas' Citadel. Everyone starts shaking, and Citadel resolves. Noah plays a forest from the top of his library through Citadel. He pays 3 life to cast Praetor's Grasp from the top of his library, targeting Zach. He fetches up a card face down into exile. Noah casts the card he fetched, which is a Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He pays a life and casts Sensei's Divining Top from the top of his library through Bolas' Citadel. He pays 2 life to cast Golgari's Signet through Citadel. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond through Citadel. He activates Sensei's Divining Top, drawing a card and putting top on top. He pays a life to cast Sensei's Divining Top through Citadel. He pays 3 life to cast Grim Tutor through Citadel. He fetches up a card into his hand and loses 3 life. He casts Aetherflux Reservoir. Noah then presents a loop of activating top, drawing a card, then paying 1 life to cast it through Citadel. Each time, Aetherflux triggers, gaining more and more life. He does this until he has enough life to activate Aetherflux, killing each opponent, and Noah wins the game. Well, that was an amazing win from Noah. Since that game was so quick, let's do another. In this game, Dante is piloting the partner pair of Thrasios Triton Hero and Kodama of the East Tree. This mid-range deck uses Kodama as a value engine before finding a way to generate infinite mana, sinking it into Thrasios, and winning the game. Dante's opening hand contains an Endurance, Kinnan Bonder Prodigy, Tropical Island, Basalt Monolith, Biomancer's Familiar, Urza's Saga, and an Eldritch Evolution. Next, we have Noah piloting the partner pair of Krark the Thumbless and Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. This deck seeks to cast both of its commanders and assemble a Rube Goldberg of human suffering, forcing each opponent to concede the game out of pain. Noah's opening hand contains a Gamble, Mana Crypt, Brain Freeze, Pyroblast, Island, and 2 snow-covered mountains. Steven brings back Tevesh and Rograkh, and his opening hand contains a Jeweled Lotus, Mana Crypt, Verdant Catacombs, Wishclaw Talisman, Pyroblast, Jeska's Will, and a Reverberate. Zach brings back Tymna and Kraum, and his opening hand contains a Mistcast, Necropotence, Mana Crypt, Talisman of Progress, Talisman of Dominance, Exotic Orchard, and his London Mulligan is a Dragon's Rage channeler. And Steven gets to start us off. Steven draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks his Lotus to cast his commander, Tevesh Zot, Doom of Fools. He casts his other commander, Rograkh, Son of Rograkh. He activates Tevesh's second ability, sacrificing Rograkh, drawing 3 cards. With an amazing turn 1 in the books, Steven passes, actually discarding to hand size. Zach draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Talisman of Dominance. He casts a Lotus Petal. He cracks his petal to help cast a Talisman of Progress. Feeling good, Zach passes. Dante draws and plays an Urza's Saga, getting its first counter. He passes. Noah draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts his commander, Krark the Thumbless. Noah ships the turn. At the end of Noah's turn, Steven cracks his Verdant Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. During his upkeep, Steven loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts a Wishclaw Talisman. He activates Tevesh's first ability, creating 2 Thralls. Steven ends his turn. During his upkeep, Zach loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and taps his Talisman to help cast Brainstorm. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. He plays a Volcanic Island for turn. He casts his commander, Kraum, Ludovic's Opus. He moves to combat and attacks Tevesh. Tevesh takes it, and Zach passes it to Dante. During Dante's upkeep, Dante doesn't lose his Mana Crypt roll because he's the only one who doesn't have a Mana Crypt. Who's laughing now? He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza's Saga gets another counter. He plays a Tropical Island and ends his turn. During his upkeep, Noah loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Gamble. Krark triggers, Noah loses the flip, and Gamble returns to his hand. He plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He recasts Gamble. Kraum triggers, and Zach draws. Krark triggers, Noah loses the flip, and Gamble returns to his hand again. He moves to combat and attacks Tevesh with Krark. Steven blocks with a Thrall, and Noah passes the turn. During his upkeep, Steven loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Swamp. He activates Tevesh's second ability, sacrificing a Thrall and drawing 2 cards. He recasts his commander, Rograkh. He casts Duress, targeting Zach. Kraum triggers, and Zach draws. Zach reveals his hand, and he discards Miscast. All through, Steven passes. During his upkeep, Zach loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Tevesh with Kraum. Tevesh dies, and in his second main phase, Zach taps his Talisman to cast Demonic Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand. He taps his other Talisman to cast Ranger Captain of Eos. It enters, and Zach fetches up a Dragon's Rage Channeler into his hand. He casts Dragon's Rage Channeler and passes the turn. Dante draws, and in his first main phase, Urza's Saga triggers. He floats mana and sacrifices it, fetching up a Jeweled Lotus onto the battlefield. He plays a Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth for turn. He casts Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts a Mox Amber. Kraum triggers, and Zach draws. Dante cracks his Lotus to cast his commander, Kodama of the East Tree. Dante passes. During his upkeep, Noah wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays an island. He casts his other commander, Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. It enters as a copy of Krark. Noah ends his turn. During his upkeep, Steven wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Swamp. Steven passes. During his upkeep, Zach loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and taps his Talisman to help cast his other commander, Tymna the Weaver. He moves to combat and attacks Noah with Kraum and Steven with the rest. They both take it, and in his second main phase, Zach pays 2 and draws 2 through Tymna. He plays a command tower and passes to Dante. Dante draws and casts his other commander as well, Thrasios, Triton Hero. It enters, Kodama triggers, and Dante puts Biomancer's Familiar onto the battlefield. Dante passes. At the end of Dante's turn, Noah casts Pyroblast, targeting Kraum. Both Krarks trigger, Noah wins his first flip, copying Pyroblast, targeting Kinnan. In response, Dante flashes in Endurance. Kraum triggers, and Zach draws. It enters, and Kodama and Endurance trigger. Dante has Zach put his graveyard onto the bottom of his library. Then Kodama resolves, and he puts Basalt Monolith onto the battlefield. With Kinnan and Thrasios on the battlefield, this is a huge problem. Dante taps Basalt for 4 through Kinnan. He activates the untap ability of Basalt. In response, Steven casts Pyroblast, targeting Kinnan. In response, Dante taps his Mox Amber for 2 through Kinnan to help activate the untap ability of Basalt again. In response, Steven taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Lightning Bolt, targeting Kinnan. Kraum triggers, and Zach draws. Unfortunately, Dante is out of answers, and Kinnan dies. Basalt untaps, Pyroblast fizzles, Dante floats mana, Basalt untaps again, and then Dante activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Green Sun Zenith into his hand. Finally, the second Krark trigger resolves, Noah wins the flip and copies Pyroblast, targeting Thrasios. Then Pyroblast destroys both Kraum and Thrasios. The turn finally moves to Noah. During his upkeep, Noah loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Heat Shimmer, targeting Sakashima. Kark and Sakashima trigger. Noah loses his first flip and wins his second, copying and bouncing Heat Shimmer. In response, Steven casts Imp's Mischief, targeting Heat Shimmer. Steven changes the target of Heat Shimmer to his own Rograkh and loses 3 life. Then Heat Shimmer resolves and Noah creates a copy of Rograkh. Noah casts Gamble. Kark and Sakashima trigger. Noah wins a flip and Gamble copies. He fetches up a card into his hand and randomly discards Heat Shimmer. Noah loses his second flip and returns Gamble back to his hand. Noah pays 2 life to cast Jataxian Probe, targeting Zack. Kark and Sakashima trigger. In response, Zack casts Intuition. He fetches up a Dress Down, Underworld Breach, and a Savine's Reclamation. Steven gives him Dress Down. With the triggers still on the stack, Zack exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand and adds a red. He flashes in a Dress Down. It enters and Zack draws. Noah sighs and resolves his triggers. He wins his first flip, copying Probe, targeting Steven. He looks at Steven's hand and draws a card. He wins his second flip, copying Probe, targeting Dante. He looks at Dante's hand and draws a card. Finally, the original resolves and he looks at Zack's hand and draws a card. Noah plays a Flooded Strand for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts Grape Shot with a storm count of 7 with the copies targeting Ranger Captain, Biomancer's Familiar, Rograkh, and Zack for 1 to send a message. The creatures die and Noah passes. At the end of Noah's turn, his copy of Rograkh dies and Zack sacrifices Dress Down. During his upkeep, Steven wins his mana crypt roll. He draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Blood Crypt onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He activates Wishclaw, giving it to Dante and fetching up a card into his hand. He casts Cabal Ritual with Threshold, adding 5 black. He casts Jessica's Will, targeting Zack. He holds priority and taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Reiterate with buyback, targeting Jessica's Will. This is an infinite mana combo, so in response, Zack casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Jessica's Will. Zack finally remembers his Channeler trigger and he surveils 1, putting Tarnished Citadel into his graveyard. Jessica's Will is countered and Reiterate fizzles. With nothing else to do, Steven passes to Zack. During his upkeep, Zack wins his mana crypt roll. He draws and casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He moves to combat and attacks Steven with Tymna and Noah with his Channeler, which now has Delirium. They both take it and Zack gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Zack pays 2 life and draws 2 cards through Tymna. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Windswept Heath. He taps his Talisman to cast Esper Sentinel. Zack casts Thassa's Oracle. It resolves, and with the ETB on the stack, Zack casts Tainted Pact. In response, Noah casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Pact. Kark, Sakashima, and Esper Sentinel all trigger. In response, Zack taps his Talisman to cast Mystical Tutor. He fetches up a Pact of Negation onto the top of his library. Then Esper Sentinel resolves and Zack draws. With the triggers still on the stack, Zack casts Pact of Negation, targeting Mindbreak Trap. Trap is countered, and now it is up to the gods of luck to not have a Kark or Sakashima trigger copy that Mindbreak. Noah rolls and loses his first trigger. He rolls his second and loses again. Zack cheers as luck appears to be on his side tonight. So, Noah casts Pact of Negation, targeting Tainted Pact. Zack cannot believe his luck and Kark and Sakashima trigger. Noah wins his first roll, copying Pact, targeting Pact. He wins his second, copying again and targeting Pact. Tainted Pact is countered and the other 2 Pact of Negations fizzle, and then Thassa's Oracle's trigger finally resolves. Zack looks at the top 2 cards and puts them both on bottom. After a valiant fight, Zack gives the turn to Dante. Dante draws and starts off his turn by casting Time Twister. Esper triggers and Zack draws. Each player then shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library and draws 7. He plays a Wooded Foothills for turn. Kodama triggers and Dante puts a Scalding Tarn onto the battlefield. He cracks his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a Breeding Pool onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. Kodama triggers and he puts an island onto the battlefield. He cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up an island onto the battlefield. Kodama triggers and he declines to put anything in. He moves to combat and attacks Steven with Kodama. Steven takes it and Dante passes the turn. During his upkeep, Noah wins his mana crypt roll. He pays for his Pact of Negation and draws for turn. He plays a Scalding Tarn. He casts Mox Diamond. Esper triggers and Zack draws. Diamond resolves and Noah discards Bloodstained Mire. He cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a mountain onto the battlefield. He casts Overmaster. Kark and Sakashima trigger. Noah wins his first roll and copies Overmaster. Holding priority, Noah casts Tybalt's Trickery, targeting his own Overmaster. Kark and Sakashima trigger again. In response, Dante casts Flusterstorm with copies targeting both Overmasters and Tybalt's Trickery. All are countered, and then Noah wins his first flip. He copies Tybalt's Trickery, but it has no targets and fizzles. He loses his second flip, and then he wins his original card flip, creating a copy of Overmaster. The copy resolves, and Noah draws. With nothing else to do, Noah ends his turn. During his upkeep, Steven wins his mana crypt roll. He draws and plays a mountain. He casts Sensei's Divining Top. Esper triggers, and Steven pays. He casts Grim Tutor. He fetches up a card into his hand and loses 3 life. Steven passes. During his upkeep, Zach wins his mana crypt roll. He pays for his Pact of Negation and draws for turn. He casts Imperial Seal. In response, Dante casts Swan Song, targeting Imp Seal. Esper Sentinel triggers, and Dante pays. Imp Seal is countered, and Zach creates a 2/2 bird. Zach moves to combat and attacks Dante with Tymna and Darcy, and Steven with Sentinel and Thoracle. They both take it, and Zach gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Tymna triggers and Zach responds. He casts Vampiric Tutor. Channeler triggers, and Zach surveils Scrubland into his graveyard. Then, he fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Tymna's trigger resolves, and Zach pays 2 and draws 2 through Tymna. He plays an Urza Saga for turn, getting its first counter. He casts a Soul Ring. He taps his Talisman to help cast Toxic Deluge, paying 6 life. Zach wipes the entire board and passes to Dante. Dante draws and plays a Waterlogged Grove. He casts his commander, Thrasios. Dante ends his turn. During his upkeep, Noah loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Training Center. He recasts his commander, Krark the Thumbless. He casts Talisman of Creativity. He casts a Mystic Remora. Noah passes. At the end of Noah's turn, Steven activates his top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. During his upkeep, Steven wins his mana crypt roll. He draws and plays a Luxury Suite. He recasts Tevesh. Remora triggers, and Noah draws. He activates Tevesh's first ability, creating 2 Thralls. Steven ships the turn to Zach. During his upkeep, Zach loses his mana crypt roll. He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a Wooded Foothills for turn. He casts a Wishclaw Talisman. Remora triggers, and Noah draws. Zach activates Wishclaw, giving it to Steven and fetching up a card into his hand. He cracks his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts Peer into the Abyss. Remora triggers, and Noah draws. Unfortunately, no one has an answer, and Peer resolves. Zach draws 36 cards and loses half of his life rounded up. Zach taps his Talisman to cast Dark Ritual. Remora triggers, and Noah draws. In response, Noah casts Muddle the Mixture, targeting Dark Ritual. Krark triggers, Noah wins the flip, copying Muddle, targeting Ritual. In response, Zach casts Pact of Negation, targeting the original Muddle. Remora triggers, and Noah draws. Pact counters Muddle, and with the copy on the stack, Zach casts Swan Song, targeting the copy. Remora triggers, and Noah draws again. Swan Song counters Muddle, and Noah creates a 2/2 bird. And then Dark Ritual resolves, adding 3 black. Zach casts Cabal Ritual with Threshold. Noah draws through Remora, and Zach adds 5 black. He casts an Arcane Signet, and Noah draws through Remora. Zach casts Dockside Extortionist. In response, Steven activates top, drawing a card and putting top on top. Then Dockside enters, and Zach creates 9 treasures. Zach casts Gamble, and Noah draws through Remora. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Savine's Reclamation. He casts Ranger Captain of Eos. It resolves, and Zach fails to find a 1-drop. He cracks his Ranger Captain, silencing his opponents this turn. He casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside, creating 9 more treasures. He casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift, Noah draws through Remora, Dante floats mana, and then his opponents bounce their non-land permanents. Zach moves to a second main phase, fizzling Dante's mana. He casts Underworld Breach. He casts Brain Freeze, with all copies targeting himself, milling the rest of his library. He escapes Thassa's Oracle from his graveyard. Thassa's Oracle enters, and Zach wins the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what a crazy fun set of games tonight. Congrats to Noah and Zach on their wins tonight. In Game 1, Noah was able to absolutely slam home a turn 2 win with his Citadel combo. It went off before anyone had a chance to even stabilize. In Game 2, the battles were very hard fought, and each person scratched every inch of advantage they could. In the end, Zach was able to pull off a win with some well-executed gameplay. The most valuable card in Game 1 goes to Bolas' Citadel. It was no question that this card gave Noah what he needed to win the game. He could cast spells repeatedly off the top, assemble what he needed, and closed out the game in quick fashion. The most valuable card in Game 2 goes to Pact of Negation. Holy smokes, was this card thrown around a lot tonight. We have received so many free counterspells over the course of Magic's history, and this one is still one of the top dogs. no conditions or restrictions the turn you cast it, this card is perfect to protect yourself when you have barely enough resources to win. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time when we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.